It all began with a simple act of kindness. In a world where people often walk past each other without even making eye contact, one woman chose to stop, smile, and share food with a stranger. She had no idea that this small gesture would change her life forever. The city was alive with noise. Car horns, footsteps, chatter, and a never-ending rush of people moving from one place to another. Everyone had somewhere to go, something urgent to do, someone waiting for them. But within that busy crowd, there were those who had nowhere to go, people the world had forgotten, people who blended into the background like shadows on the pavement. On the corner of that bustling park, there was an old man. His clothes were wrinkled, his shoes worn down, and his posture bent from years of hardship. He sat quietly on the same wooden bench every evening, holding his hands together as though he was trying to keep warmth trapped inside his palms. His face was lined with age, but his eyes revealed something deeper, an emptiness, a loneliness so heavy that it made his presence almost invisible to those who passed him by. But on this particular evening, someone did notice him. Angela. She was just another face in the crowd, or so it seemed. A woman in her late 30s, strong-willed, soft-spoken, and hard-working. She was the kind of person who carried the weight of her struggles with grace, never letting the world see the exhaustion behind her smile. She didn't have much, a small apartment, a modest job, and just enough money to pay her bills and keep food on the table. But despite her limited means, Angela had something the world often lacked: compassion. That evening, Angela carried a small bag in her hand, filled with food she had prepared earlier. She was tired from her long shift, her feet aching. But as she crossed the park, her eyes caught the sight of the old man sitting alone. She had noticed him before, several times actually. Every day, she walked past him on her way home. Sometimes he was staring at the ground, sometimes at the sky, and sometimes at nothing at all. He never asked for money, never begged, never stopped anyone. He just sat there, silent, forgotten. But tonight felt different. The air was colder than usual. A sharp breeze made her pull her sweater tighter. She could see the old man's hands trembling, his thin body shivering, as though he was battling the wind all alone, and something inside her heart ached. She slowed her steps, her conscience whispering, "Don't just walk away this time." Angela stood there for a moment, caught in an internal struggle. She had just enough food for herself, and tomorrow's work would be another long day. But as she looked at him, hunched over, fragile and completely alone, the choice became clear. She walked toward the bench. At first, the old man didn't even look up. He was so used to being ignored that he assumed this was just another passerby. But then he heard her gentle voice. "Sir," she said softly, "are you hungry?" The old man raised his head slowly, almost startled by the kindness in her tone. His eyes, tired and dim, blinked at her as if to make sure she was really speaking to him. For a moment, he didn't answer, perhaps because no one had asked him that question in so long. Finally, he nodded faintly. Angela smiled, sitting down beside him without hesitation. She opened her bag and pulled out a sandwich she had made earlier that day. It wasn't anything fancy, just bread, cheese, and a little chicken, but it was warm, fresh, and filled with care. She broke it in half and offered it to him. "Here," she said, "let's share." For a brief second, the old man hesitated. His pride wrestled with his hunger. He wasn't used to accepting charity. But there was something different about this woman. She wasn't looking down on him. She wasn't pitying him. She was treating him like a human being, like a friend. And so, with shaky hands, he took the sandwich. The first bite brought tears to his eyes, not because of the taste, but because of the feeling. It had been so long since someone had cared enough to sit beside him, to break bread with him, to treat him as though he belonged. Angela ate her half of the sandwich quietly, giving him time. She didn't bombard him with questions, didn't pry into his life. She just sat there, smiling, eating, and allowing the silence between them to feel comfortable. Slowly, the old man began to relax. "Thank you," he whispered finally, his voice hoarse. Angela turned to him and said, "No need to thank me. Everyone deserves a meal." And in that simple moment, something shifted. The noise of the city faded into the background. The busy footsteps, the honking horns, the rushing crowd. It all seemed distant, unimportant. What mattered was a small wooden bench, the old man and the woman who chose to care. For Angela, it was just a sandwich. For him, it was hope. Little did she know that single act of kindness was the first thread in a story that would weave both of their lives into something far greater than she could ever imagine. And so, the story began not with wealth, not with fame, not with power, but with a sandwich shared on a cold evening between a tired woman and a lonely old man. Sometimes, the greatest stories are born from the smallest moments. Angela was a hardworking woman, living paycheck to paycheck. She didn't have much, but she always carried a warm heart. Every day after work, she passed by a park where an old man sat alone on the same wooden bench. He looked frail, tired, and forgotten by the world. Angela's life was a story of quiet struggle. She wasn't the kind of woman who made headlines, nor the kind who people stopped to admire. She was ordinary in the world's eyes, just another face in the endless crowd of workers. But behind that ordinariness was a strength that few could see. She woke up before the sun, her alarm clock ringing at 5 each morning. Her small apartment barely had enough space for the old mattress she slept on, the squeaky table by the window, and the little stove where she prepared her meals. The wallpaper was peeling, and sometimes the water in the sink ran brown before it cleared. But it was home. She had grown used to making do with little. Angela worked as a cleaner in an office building downtown. The job was demanding, the pay was small, and the hours were long. Most nights, she returned home exhausted, her hands red from scrubbing, her back aching from bending over floors. Yet, despite the exhaustion, she never let bitterness creep into her heart. She believed in something most people had forgotten: kindness. Angela's co-workers often teased her for always smiling, even when her boss barked orders or when rude strangers left messes behind without a thought. "Why are you always so cheerful?" they would ask. But Angela would simply shrug and say, "Because life's hard enough. A smile doesn't cost me anything." It was during her walk home from work that Angela often saw him, the old man on the bench. The first time, she almost missed him. He blended into the background of the park, sitting quietly like he had always been part of the scenery. He didn't move much, didn't talk, didn't ask for help. He just sat there with his head bowed and his hands folded. But something about him caught Angela's attention. Maybe it was the way he seemed invisible to everyone else, or maybe it was the way loneliness wrapped around him like a heavy coat. Each day, as she passed, she found her eyes drifting toward him. Even when she tried to look away, she noticed the details. The man's coat was too thin for the weather. His shoes had holes that revealed the socks beneath, and the socks were torn. His hair was white, uncombed, and his face carried wrinkles not just from age, but from years of hardship. There was a sadness in his posture, the kind of sadness that comes from being forgotten by the world. Angela felt a tug in her heart every time she saw him. She knew what it felt like to be invisible, to be overlooked. She too had walked past people who never bothered to see her. She too had stood in grocery lines where people spoke over her as if she wasn't there. Life in the city had a way of making people invisible if they didn't shine bright with wealth or power. One evening, after another exhausting shift, Angela stopped a little longer than usual. She stood at the edge of the park, her bag of groceries in hand, and watched the old man. He didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the ground. People walked by in suits and fancy clothes, but not a single person slowed their steps. Not one person noticed him. Angela whispered to herself, "Why does no one see him?" That question stayed with her even as she continued walking. That night, lying on her mattress, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the image of the old man's bent shoulders and trembling hands. She tossed and turned, thinking of her own father, who had passed away years ago. He too had grown frail in his final days, and she remembered how deeply he had longed for company. The thought broke her heart. The next day, she walked past him again. This time, she slowed her steps. She almost stopped, but something inside her hesitated. What if he didn't want her to bother him? What if he got angry? She kept walking, but guilt clung to her like a shadow. By the third day, Angela made a decision. She would no longer walk past pretending not to see. She didn't have much, but she could at least give him a smile, a kind word, maybe even some food. She wanted him to know that he wasn't invisible. And so, every evening after work, she began taking a different path, one that led her directly past his bench. Sometimes she saw him with his head bowed, sometimes with his face tilted toward the sky, as though searching for something beyond the clouds. She wondered what thoughts filled his mind. Was he remembering his youth? Was he grieving something or someone? Angela knew nothing about him yet, but in her heart, she felt a strange connection. Perhaps it was empathy. Perhaps it was destiny. Days passed, and her curiosity deepened. One late afternoon, the golden rays of the sun cast long shadows in the park. Angela approached from a distance, and for the first time, she noticed the old man's eyes. They weren't just tired. They were lonely, hollow, searching for warmth that never came. And in that moment, her decision was final. She would not just notice him anymore. She would act. She tightened her grip on the small bag she carried. Inside were 2 sandwiches she had made that morning, one for her, and an extra, though she hadn't known why she packed it. Maybe her heart had already decided before her mind did. Angela took a deep breath. She was nervous, though she didn't know why. It felt almost like stepping into a story bigger than herself. She walked toward the bench with steady steps, her heart pounding in her chest. When she reached him, she paused for a moment, looking at him closely for the first time. His skin was weathered, his hands thin, veins visible beneath fragile skin. His lips trembled slightly, but no words came. He seemed lost in a world far away. Angela smiled softly and said, "Good evening, sir." The old man blinked, as if waking from a dream. He looked up at her with surprise, as though no one had spoken to him in weeks. His voice cracked when he replied, "Good evening." It was a simple exchange. But for Angela, it was the beginning of something extraordinary. This was the world Angela lived in, a life of quiet battles, hidden kindness, and choices that most people might overlook. Yet those choices, the choice to notice, to pause, to care, were about to open a door to a story far greater than she ever imagined. She thought she was just passing by a lonely man in the park. But in truth, she was walking straight into a destiny that would one day connect her with unimaginable wealth, powerful secrets, and a billionaire who had forgotten the most important lesson of all, the value of love. And it all started with Angela's heart that refused to let someone remain invisible. One chilly evening, Angela noticed the old man shivering. She had packed an extra sandwich for herself that day. Without a second thought, she walked up to him and said, "Sir, would you like to share a meal with me?" His eyes lit up, and for the first time in days, a faint smile appeared on his face. The evening air was biting cold, the kind that crept into your bones and lingered even when you pulled your sweater tight around your body. The park looked different in the twilight. The trees swayed as the wind whispered through them. The grass rustled softly, and the street lamps flickered to life one by one, casting dim golden halos across the pavement. Angela's steps were slower than usual that night. Work had drained her. Her body felt heavy, her mind cluttered with worries about bills, rent, and the rising cost of everything. Yet despite her own struggles, she found herself thinking once again of the old man who sat on the same wooden bench near the fountain. As she approached the park, her eyes instinctively searched for him, and there he was, just as always, hunched over, clutching his thin coat tighter around himself. But tonight, he looked different, more fragile. His shoulders shook slightly. His lips trembled as though even the act of breathing was a struggle. Angela's heart tightened. She stopped in her tracks, standing for a moment in silence, debating with herself. She had brought an extra sandwich, though she didn't know why. Maybe it was fate. Maybe it was her heart preparing for this very moment. The thought of walking past him again felt impossible. Taking a deep breath, Angela walked toward the bench. Each step felt like a decision, like crossing into a space where kindness outweighed hesitation. "Sir," she said softly when she reached him. The old man looked up slowly. His eyes were tired, sunken with age, but in them was a flicker of something fragile. Hope, perhaps, or surprise. He blinked as though it had been years since someone had spoken to him with gentleness. Angela held out the sandwich, her voice steady yet warm. "Would you like to share a meal with me?" For a long moment, Silence hung between them. The old man stared at the sandwich, his expression caught between pride and hunger. His hands trembled slightly, and Angela could see the battle within him, whether to accept or refuse. Finally, he nodded. Angela sat down beside him without hesitation, unwrapping the sandwich and breaking it into two halves. She offered him one piece, and when he took it, she noticed the tears welling in his eyes. He tried to hide them, looking away as though embarrassed. He lifted the sandwich to his mouth and took a careful bite. His lips quivered, his jaw moved slowly, and with that first taste, something seemed to soften inside him. A faint smile touched his face, a smile that had been buried beneath layers of loneliness. Angela took a bite of her half and sat quietly beside him. She didn't push him into conversation, didn't bombard him with questions. She simply let the moment exist, letting the silence be filled not with awkwardness but with comfort. The old man cleared his throat after a while. "Thank you," he said, his voice raspy and weak, as though unused to speaking. Angela smiled warmly. "You don't have to thank me. Everyone deserves a meal." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw his eyes clearly. They were filled with stories untold, with memories heavy and unspoken. He seemed like a man who had once carried the weight of a life full of meaning, only to find himself abandoned in the shadows of time. Angela noticed his hands, thin, bony, covered with veins that rose against his skin. They trembled as he held the sandwich, and she wondered how long it had been since someone had reached out to him with kindness. As they sat there eating, the world around them carried on. Children laughed as they ran past. Couples strolled by holding hands, and people hurried across the park, too busy to notice. But in that little corner, on that wooden bench, something extraordinary was unfolding. A connection, a bond born not from wealth, not from obligation, but from the simplest act of sharing food. Angela thought her father again, of the night she had sat with him when he was sick, feeding him spoonfuls of soup and listening to his soft stories. She felt that same tenderness now, sitting beside the stranger. When they finished eating, the old man leaned back slowly, his posture a little less burdened. He let out a soft sigh, a sigh not just of relief from hunger, but of comfort from being seen. "What's your name, sir?" Angela asked gently. He hesitated, as though in used introductions. Then he said, "Thomas. My name is Thomas." Angela smiled. "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Thomas. My name is Angela." For the first time, Mr. Thomas repeated her name softly, as though tasting the sound of it. Angela. His lips curved slightly, almost as if saying her name reminded him that kindness still existed. They didn't speak much after that. Words weren't necessary. The simple act of sitting together, of sharing a meal, had already built something invisible yet strong between them. When Angela finally stood up to leave, she said, "I'll see you tomorrow, Mr. Thomas." He looked at her, eyes wide with surprise, as though he hadn't expected her to ever return. "Tomorrow?" he asked. Angela nodded. "Yes, tomorrow." And with that, she walked away, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. Behind her, Mr. Thomas remained on the bench, holding on to memory of that evening like a treasure. For the first time in years, he felt something stir within him. Hope. That chilly evening marked the true beginning. A beginning not just of shared meals, but of shared hearts. Angela had no idea what destiny was about to unfold, but one thing was certain. Neither she nor Mr. Thomas would ever see life the same way again. That one sandwich turned into a routine. Every evening, Angela would bring food, and they would sit together, eating, laughing, and talking. She learned that his name was Mr. Thomas. He was quiet at first, but slowly he opened up about his younger days, his love for gardening, and how lonely he felt now. The first evening Angela shared her food with Mr. Thomas felt like a small moment, but what she didn't realize was that she had opened the door to something lasting. When she promised, "I'll see you tomorrow," she had spoken casually, but in her heart, she meant it. And when Angela made a promise, she kept it. The very next evening, after finishing her long day at work, she stopped by her little kitchen before heading home. She prepared a meal, not just for herself, but for two. It wasn't much. Some rice, beans, and a piece of chicken she had saved from the night before. but she packed it carefully, wrapping it in foil to keep it warm. Then, with her small bag in hand, she walked straight to the park bench where Mr. Thomas always sat. Sure enough, there he was. Angela's heart softened at the sight. He was sitting with his hands folded in his lap, his head lowered, his thin body curved like a question mark against the wind. But when he saw her approach, something flickered in his tired eyes, recognition, and more than that, expectation. "You came back," he said softly, his voice carrying both surprise and gratitude. Angela smiled warmly. "Of course I did. I told you I would." She sat beside him, opened a small package of food, and handed him a portion. His hands trembled slightly as he accepted it. This time, there was no hesitation, no pride holding him back. He took it with a quiet thank you, and together they began to eat. That night, they spoke a little more than the first. Angela asked him about his favorite foods, and he admitted he used to love apple pie, but hadn't tasted one in years. She chuckled, telling him about how her baking skills were terrible. And for the first time, Mr. Thomas let out a soft laugh, a sound rusty from disuse, but beautiful to hear. From that day onward, it became their routine. Every evening, without fail, Angela showed up with food. Sometimes it was sandwiches, sometimes warm soup in a thermos, and sometimes leftover dinner from her small kitchen. She never came empty-handed. But more than the food, she brought something else, companionship. At first, Mr. Thomas was cautious. He answered her questions with short replies, kept his stories brief, and often looked away as though unsure if she really cared. But Angela never rushed him. She had patience, the kind that came from understanding loneliness herself. Slowly, day by day, his walls began to crumble. One evening, as they shared a meal beneath the orange glow of the setting sun, Mr. Thomas spoke about his younger days. "I used to love gardening," he said quietly, his eyes brightening with the memory. "I had a little house with a big yard. Roses, tulips, daisies, you name it, I grew it. My favorite was sunflowers. They always turned their faces toward the light." Angela listened intently, smiling. "That sounds beautiful. Do you miss it?" He nodded, a shadow crossing his face. Every day, life was different then. Another evening, he told her about how he used to walk for miles just to watch the sunrise. "Mornings always gave me hope," he said, his voice distant, as though speaking to his past. "But now, mornings are just cold." Angela's heart ached at his words. She realized then how deeply loneliness had wrapped around him. It wasn't just hunger of the stomach. It was hunger of the soul. He wasn't starving for food alone. He was starving for connection, for someone to listen, someone to see him. So she listened. She saw him. And with every story he shared, Mr. Thomas seemed to grow lighter. Angela often filled the silences with stories of her own, not grand tales, but simple ones from her daily life. She told him about the funny mistakes she made at work, about the noisy kids who lived in her building, about her favorite songs from church. Mr. Thomas would listen with a small smile, sometimes chuckling softly, sometimes closing his eyes as though savoring the sound of her voice. It wasn't long before laughter began to fill the bench. Angela would make silly jokes just to hear him laugh again, and slowly, the park bench that once symbolized his loneliness became a place of warmth. One chilly evening, she even brought him a scarf she had knitted herself years ago. It was old, a little worn, but still warm. She wrapped it gently around his neck, and he held it with trembling fingers, his eyes glistening. "No one's done something like this for me in a long time," he whispered. Angela smiled, her own eyes misty. "Well, you deserve it, Mr. Thomas." Over time, Angela began to notice small changes in him. His posture wasn't always hunched anymore. He began greeting her with a faint smile before she even sat down. His voice grew a little stronger, and his eyes, though still tired, carried a spark that hadn't been there before. She didn't realize it, but she was becoming the highlight of his days, the one person who reminded him he wasn't forgotten. And Mr. Thomas, in return, gave Angela something too. Though she was the one bringing the food, he gave her stories, wisdom, and the warmth of companionship. After long, exhausting days of cleaning offices where no one even knew her name, Angela found herself looking forward to the evenings when she could sit on that bench, share a meal, and talk with her new friend. It became their ritual, their quiet sanctuary away from the noise of the city. Angela didn't know much about his past yet. Why he was always alone, why no family seemed to visit him, why he never left the park bench for long. But she didn't press. She believed in letting people share their stories when they were ready. For now, it was enough just to sit beside him, to eat, to talk, and to laugh. And so, day after day, their bond grew. What started as a single sandwich had now blossomed into something far greater, a friendship, a bond between a woman who had little but gave much, and a man who had once had much but was left with little. Together, they filled each other's emptiness. Neither of them knew it yet, but these simple evenings were leading towards something far bigger than either of them could imagine. For Angela, it was just kindness. For Mr. Thomas, it was salvation. And for both, it was the beginning of a story that would change their lives forever. Angela never judged him for his worn-out clothes or trembling hands. She listened with patience, treated him with respect, and spoke to him like family. To her, he wasn't just an old man on a park bench. He was someone who mattered. Angela's kindness wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and deeply human. She didn't rush through conversations with Mr. Thomas. She didn't look away when his voice cracked or when his hands shook as he tried to hold a spoon. Instead, she leaned closer, offering comfort with her presence and patience. For Angela, it wasn't about pity. Pity makes someone feel small. Compassion makes someone feel seen. And Angela, with her gentle spirit, always chose compassion. Every evening when she arrived at the park with her little meal container, Mr. Thomas's eyes brightened. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't forgotten. He wasn't just another old man sitting alone while the world hurried past. To Angela, he was a storyteller, a man with a past, and above all, he was worthy of dignity. Angela's own life wasn't easy. She lived in a tiny apartment, worked long shifts at a local grocery store, and often skipped luxuries to make ends meet. Some weeks, even a proper dinner was a challenge. Yet, she always managed to pack a little extra food, not because she had plenty, but because she believed in sharing the little she did have. Her coworkers used to laugh gently at her. "Why do you waste your time with that old man, Angie?" one of them teased. "You can barely afford food for yourself." Angela would just smile and answer softly, because sometimes love and kindness feed the soul more than food feeds the body. It was this unshakable belief that made her different. Small acts of care. Angela noticed the little things. If the weather was chilly, she would bring an extra scarf for Mr. Thomas. If it was too hot, she carried a bottle of cold water. When his hands trembled too much to hold his sandwich, she broke it into smaller pieces so he could eat more easily. And every time Mr. Thomas's eyes filled with gratitude. "Why are you so kind to me?" he once asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Angela smiled, placing her hand gently over his. "Because kindness costs nothing, but it means everything." Those words sank deep into his heart. Most people passed by without noticing Mr. Thomas. They were too busy staring at their phones, rushing to their jobs, or simply avoiding the uncomfortable sight of an old man who seemed fragile and forgotten. But Angela stopped, and that single choice, to see him when no one else did, was a powerful act of humanity. She didn't know his history, his wealth, or who he had once been. She only saw the present, a lonely man who deserved love. Their bond wasn't always heavy or sad. There were moments of pure joy, too. Sometimes Mr. Thomas told silly jokes from his youth that made Angela laugh so hard her eyes watered. Other times, Angela shared stories about her childhood, like how she and her siblings used to race barefoot in the rain, or how her mother taught her to stretch a single meal to feed everyone at the table. They found comfort in these exchanges. The world outside was noisy and uncaring, but on that park bench, over shared food, there was laughter, connection, and peace. One of the most beautiful things about Angela's compassion was the way she treated Mr. Thomas with respect. She never spoke to him like he was helpless. She never made him feel like a burden. Instead, she asked for his advice, valued his opinions, and encouraged him to share his wisdom. "Mr. Thomas," she once asked as they sat watching the sunset, "what's one thing you've learned about life?" He thought for a moment, his wrinkled face reflecting the fading light. Then he said quietly, "That people forget what you own. They forget your success, but they never forget how you made them feel." Angela nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. "That's true. And I'll never forget how you made me feel. Like family." For Mr. Thomas, Angela's kindness was more than food. It was a reminder that he still mattered. For years, he had felt abandoned, as though the world had no space for him anymore. But Angela changed that. She reminded him that his presence still had value, that his voice still carried meaning. Every thank you, every smile, every shared meal was like a thread weaving him back in the fabric of life. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, Mr. Thomas shared glimpses of his past. He spoke of his younger years, of raising a son, of the dreams he once had. Angela always listened intently, never interrupting, never rushing him. She knew these memories were precious, pieces of a man's soul that needed to be heard. And though he never mentioned his estranged son by name, there was always a shadow in his eyes, a pain that Angela could sense but chose not to press. She respected his silence, knowing he would speak when he was ready. Angela's compassion was simple yet powerful. It wasn't about charity. It wasn't about making herself feel better. It was about genuine love for another human being. She believed deeply that everyone deserves dignity, whether rich or poor, young or old, healthy or frail. And she lived that belief every time she sat with Mr. Thomas, every time she shared her food, every time she made him laugh. It was this quiet, steadfast compassion that would later ripple far beyond the park bench. For now, though, Angela didn't think about the future. She simply did what felt right in the present. And in doing so, she unknowingly began to heal wounds much deeper than she could imagine. What Angela didn't know was that Mr. Thomas wasn't just any old man. He had a son he hadn't seen in years. And not just any son, but a world-famous billionaire, known for his companies, his wealth, and his power. But behind all the fame, that son had drifted away from his father. Angela's kindness flowed naturally, like a river that never questioned why it gave water. To her, Mr. Thomas was simply a lonely old man who needed care. She never asked about his past, never wondered why no family came to visit him, and never questioned why he sat on that same park bench every evening. But Mr. Thomas carried secrets in his silence. Secrets Angela could not have imagined. For the world, he looked like an ordinary old man, worn down by life. But once, many years ago, Mr. Thomas had been someone entirely different. He wasn't rich, he wasn't powerful, but he was the father of a boy who would one day grow to be one of the most influential men alive. His son's name was Richard Thomas. Richard wasn't just successful, he was a billionaire, the kind whose name appeared on the covers of magazines, whose face filled business news channels, whose companies stretched across continents. People admired his brilliance, envied his wealth, and feared his power. To the world, Richard was untouchable, a symbol of ambition and success. But behind all the wealth and fame, there was a truth the world didn't see. Richard and his father had drifted apart. It wasn't always this way. When Richard was a boy, he had adored his father. Mr. Thomas worked simple jobs, but he always found time to sit with his son in the garden, teaching him how to plant seeds, how to water them, and how patience made things grow. Life is like a garden, he used to say. You get out what you put in. Love, care, time, that's what makes things bloom. Those lessons shaped Richard's mind. They taught him persistence, discipline, and vision. But as he grew older, as success demanded more of him, Richard began to drift. At first, it was subtle. Missed phone calls, excuses about work, promises to visit that never materialized. Then, as the years passed and his empire grew, the distance widened. Richard moved into mansions, flew in private jets, and sat in boardrooms with the most powerful people in the world. Meanwhile, his father's calls went unanswered. Letters were never replied to. Mr. Thomas watched from afar as his son became the man the world celebrated, but also the man who had forgotten him. The pain of it was heavier than hunger, colder than the wind that cut through his worn coat. Mr. Thomas wasn't bitter about the wealth. He didn't envy the power. What broke his heart was the absence of love. The boy he had once cradled in his arms, the boy who once ran to him with wide eyes and laughter, was now a man too busy to even ask, "Dad, how are you?" And so Mr. Thomas faded into loneliness. He never spoke of it to Angela. He couldn't bring himself to tell her the truth, that while she was giving him sandwiches and warm company, his own son, with billions at his disposal, hadn't sat with him in years. Sometimes, though, his silence gave him away. Angela noticed it in the way he paused when families walked past him in the park. She noticed the way his eyes lingered on fathers holding their children's hands. She noticed the way he sometimes sighed in the middle of their conversations, his words trailing off into memories he didn't share. One evening, as Angela handed him a warm bowl of soup, Mr. Thomas whispered almost to himself, "Funny thing about life, sometimes the ones who have everything forget the ones who gave them everything." Angela tilted her head, curious, but didn't press. She could see the sadness behind his words, and she knew that when he was ready, he would open up. Until then, her role was to listen, to comfort, and to remind him that he wasn't alone. Little did she know, the man sitting beside her wasn't just battling loneliness. He was a father of one of the richest men in the world. And though Richard lived in a world of luxury far removed from this small park bench, fate was quietly preparing to bring their lives together again. Mr. Thomas often thought of his son at night. When the park grew quiet and the stars blinked above, he would close his eyes and imagine Richard as a boy again, running barefoot through the garden, laughing as he chased butterflies, tugging at his father's sleeve to show him the flowers they had planted. "Dad," little Richard had once said, holding up a sunflower seed, "this is so small. How can something this tiny become so big?" And Mr. Thomas had replied, "Because inside it, there's life waiting to grow, just like inside you, son." Those words had stayed with Richard. They were part of the foundation of his empire, though he never admitted it. Every business he built, every deal he made, came from the persistence and patience his father had once taught him. Yet, in the pursuit of greatness, he had left behind the very man who had planted those seeds in him. Mr. Thomas carried that contradiction silently, pride for the man his son had become, and sorrow for the bond that had been lost. Angela, meanwhile, continued her routine with joy, unaware of the history sitting beside her. To her, Mr. Thomas was not defined by who his son was or what he lacked. He was simply Mr. Thomas, the kind, gentle soul who loved gardening and once dreamed of watching sunflowers bloom again. And maybe that was why he cherished her visits so much. With Angela, he wasn't a forgotten father of a billionaire. He wasn't a man abandoned in old age. He was simply seen. Yet destiny has a way of uncovering secrets. What Angela didn't know was that her kindness was slowly building a bridge she couldn't see yet, a bridge that would soon connect her life with a world she never imagined entering. For now, she remained in the dark. To her, Mr. Thomas was just a lonely old man she had befriended. To the world, he was invisible. But to one man, the billionaire who carried his name, he was a father long forgotten. And soon, those two worlds, the world of a woman with a heart of gold and the world of a man with riches beyond measure, were destined to collide in a way that would shake all three of their lives forever. One rainy evening, Angela found Mr. Thomas weaker than usual. She quickly gave him her coat and helped him walk to a nearby shelter. She stayed by his side until he felt better. The staff at the shelter, touched by her care, called Mr. Thomas's emergency contact. The sky was heavy that evening, the kind of gray that promised rain long before first drops fell. The wind blew sharp and restless, carrying with it the smell of wet earth and the sound of trees swaying. People hurried through the streets, umbrellas popping open like flowers, cars splashing through puddles, everyone rushing to find warmth and cover. Angela, as always, carried her little bag of food. Her day had been longer than usual. The office building where she worked had been chaotic. Extra shifts, piles of cleaning, a boss who barely acknowledged her presence. Her back ached. Her hands were rough from chemicals, and her body longed for rest. Yet, as tired as she was, her steps carried her to the park bench, where she knew Mr. Thomas would be. And there he was. But something was wrong. Mr. Thomas wasn't sitting upright as usual. He was slouched forward, his head low, his hands shaking more than usual. His coat, already too thin for the weather, clung damply to his frail frame as the drizzle had already started. The sight stopped Angela in her tracks. "Mr. Thomas?" she called softly as she hurried toward him. He lifted his head slowly, his eyes tired and unfocused. His lips curved into a faint smile, but it wasn't the smile she was used to. It was weak, fragile, as though even smiling cost some effort. Angela dropped her bag on the bench and quickly shrugged off her own coat. She draped it over his shoulders, ignoring the cold that instantly bit into her arms. "You're freezing," she whispered, her voice trembling with worry. Mr. Thomas tried to protest. "No, no. You'll catch cold, my dear." But Angela shook her head firmly. "I'll be fine. You need this more than I do." The drizzle grew heavier, turning into rain. People in the park scattered quickly, but Angela stayed, crouching in front of Mr. Thomas, her hands gently gripping his. His skin was icy, his breathing shallow. "Mr. Thomas, we can't stay here. You need warmth." He tried to wave her off, muttering something about not wanting to trouble her. But Angela wasn't the kind of woman who walked away when someone needed her. She stood, slung her bag over her shoulder, and carefully helped him to his feet. His legs trembled under his weight, and for a moment she thought he might collapse. She tightened her grip, guiding him slowly, step by step. "It's okay," she reassured him. "I've got you. Just lean on me." Together, they walked through the rain. Angela's clothes soaking as water dripped down her hair and face. Mr. Thomas leaned heavily on her, each step slow, but Angela never let go. Her shoes splashed through puddles, her body aching under his weight. But her determination burned brighter than her exhaustion. After what felt like forever, they reached a small shelter near the edge of the park, a place Angela had noticed before but never entered. Tonight, it became their refuge. Inside, the shelter was warm. The scent of soup filled the air, and the low murmur of voices echoed through the room. Volunteers moved about, handing out blankets and meals. The moment Angela entered with Mr. Thomas, one of the staff members rushed over. "Oh, dear, he's soaked through. Let's get him settled." Angela helped guide Mr. Thomas to a chair, her own clothes dripping wet. She stayed right beside him as the volunteers wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and handed him a steaming cup of tea. His hand shook as he held it, but the warmth began to return to his face. Angela sat close, rubbing his hands gently between hers, whispering, "You're safe now. You'll feel better soon." Mr. Thomas looked at her with watery eyes. "Why are you doing all this for me, Angela? You don't even know me." Her reply was simple, but it carried the weight of her heart. "Because no one should face the cold alone. Not while I'm here." Her words silenced him, and for a moment he closed his eyes, overwhelmed. The staff at the shelter, touched by her devotion, asked for Mr. Thomas's details. At first, he hesitated, but his body was weak, and the shelter insisted on calling someone who could be listed as his emergency contact. With shaky hands, he gave him a name and a number, a name Angela didn't recognize. She didn't think much of it. She only knew that Mr. Thomas needed care, and if there was someone who could help, then maybe this was good. Hours passed. Angela remained by his side, holding his hand as he dozed off in the chair, checking on him whenever he stirred. She ignored her own shivers, ignored her hunger, ignored the ache in her limbs. All that mattered was making sure he was okay. The volunteers brought her dry clothes to change into, and though she accepted them gratefully, she refused to leave Mr. Thomas's side. Every so often he opened his eyes and whispered, "You should go home, child. You've done enough." And every time Angela shook her head and said, "Not until you're better." Her loyalty struck everyone in the shelter. They whispered each other about the woman who gave her coat, her time, and her comfort for a man who wasn't even family. But to Angela, kindness didn't need a reason. Late into the night, the sound of heavy rain softened, replaced by the quiet hum of the shelter. Mr. Thomas was resting, wrapped warmly, breathing steadier now. Angela allowed herself to lean back, her eyelids heavy but her heart lighter. It was then that one of the shelter workers approached her. "We called as emergency contact," the woman said softly. "They're on their way." Angela nodded, not giving it much thought. She assumed it was some distant relative, maybe an old friend. She had no idea the phone call they had made would set in motion events that would change everything. Events that would soon reveal who Mr. Thomas really was and the life he had once left behind. For now, Angela simply stayed, holding his hand gently as he slept, whispering a silent prayer for his strength. She had no clue that the world outside, the world of wealth, power, and fame, was about to crash into the quiet little shelter where kindness had built a bridge between two souls. The next day, to Angela's surprise, a luxury car pulled up outside the shelter. Out stepped a man in an expensive suit, surrounded by assistants. It was none other than Richard Thomas. The billionaire's son, Mr. Thomas, had been separated from for years. The moment he walked in and saw his frail father with Angela by his side, the entire room went silent. Morning light crept to the shelter's small windows, spilling across rows of cots and chairs where tired souls found warmth after a long, cold night. The air smelled of porridge and coffee. Angela, who had dozed off while holding Mr. Thomas's hand, stirred awake as volunteers bustled around, preparing breakfast. She blinked, stretched her sore arms, and then looked at Mr. Thomas. He was awake, too, sipping tea, his face pale but calmer than the night before. Angela smiled warmly. "Good morning, Mr. Thomas. How do you feel?" He gave her a faint smile, his voice still frail. "Better because you stayed." Before Angela could respond, the sound of tires screeching against wet pavement broke through the morning calm. Heads turned toward the shelter's entrance. Outside, sleek black cars rolled to a stop, cars that didn't belong in this part of town. The doors opened and men in sharp suits stepped out, their polished shoes splashing against puddles. They scanned the area with practiced precision before opening the back door of a gleaming black Mercedes. From it stepped a man who immediately commanded attention. Tall, broad-shouldered, with an aura of authority that seemed to shift the very air around him, Richard Thomas. His tailored navy blue suit fit him perfectly, his tie crisp, his watch gleaming gold on his wrist. He looked like someone pulled straight from the cover of a financial magazine. People inside the shelter pressed closer to the windows, whispering, "Is that? No, it can't be. Wait, isn't that Richard Thomas? The billionaire?" Phones came out discreetly, photos snapped. But Angela, who didn't follow celebrity news or business headlines, had no idea who he was. She only saw a stranger, a wealthy one, judging by his appearance, walking into a place where people usually came with nothing. Richard's eyes scanned the shelter with impatience until they landed on one corner of the room. His gaze froze. There, sitting on a cot, wrapped in a blanket, was his father. For a moment, the entire world seemed to stop. The confident stride slowed. The air between them thickened with memories, some sweet, some bitter, all unspoken for years. "Dad!" Richard's voice broke the silence. Mr. Thomas looked up, and his breath caught. His eyes widened, trembling as if unsure whether he was seeing reality or a dream. His lips parted, and after what felt like a lifetime, he whispered, "Richard?" Angela, caught between them, looked from one to the other in shock. Her mind raced. Wait, his emergency contact. This man, this billionaire, is his son? The shelter fell completely silent, everyone frozen in the unfolding drama. Richard took a hesitant step forward. His usual confidence seemed to falter as he looked at the frail man before him, the father he had not seen in years. Angela felt Mr. Thomas's grip tighten on her hand. His body trembled, not just from weakness, but from the storm of emotions rushing through him. Richard's voice was low, pained. "Dad, I'm so sorry." The words hung heavy in the air, echoing louder than any speech he had ever given at boardrooms or press conferences. Mr. Thomas swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. "You remembered me?" His tone wasn't angry. It was fragile, hopeful, as though he feared his son might vanish again if he blinked. Richard moved closer, dropping the mask of a billionaire and showing, for the first time in years, the vulnerable heart of a son. "I never forgot, Dad. I lost my way." The weight of silence pressed down on the room. Angela's chest tightened as she watched the scene. She could see the regret etched into Richard's face, could feel the years of longing in Mr. Thomas's trembling voice. Then, Richard's eyes shifted, landing on Angela. He noticed the way she sat by his father's side, the way she held his hand, the way her coat was draped over him. For a moment, Richard just stared, trying to process what he was seeing. His father, not alone, but cared for by a stranger. You've been helping him? Richard asked quietly, his voice breaking the silence. Angela blinked, unsure how to answer. I just brought him meals. I couldn't stand seeing him alone. Richard's throat tightened. His gaze softened, but it also carried shame. Here was this woman, someone who had no obligation, no blood tie, giving the love and care he himself had failed to give. He turned back to his father, guilt flooding his features. Dad, I should have been here. I should have been the one. Mr. Thomas shook his head weakly. Son, I didn't need your money. I only needed you. Those words cut through Richard sharper than any business rival ever could. For all his billions, for all his power, here was the truth. His father had only wanted his presence, his love. And he had failed. The room remained hushed, the volunteers and guests at the shelter holding back tears as they watched the reunion unfold. Angela squeezed Mr. Thomas's hand gently, her own eyes stinging. She hadn't expected any of this when she first stopped to share a sandwich with a lonely old man. But now, she was watching something far greater, a broken bond beginning to mend. Richard sank to his knees beside his father's cot, something no one in his corporate world had ever seen him do. He took his father's other hand, pressing it tightly. I promise you, Dad, from today, things will be different. Mr. Thomas's lips quivered into the faintest smile, a mixture of relief and disbelief. You're here now. That's all that matters. Angela quietly rose, giving them space. She stepped back, watching from a distance as father and son held each other's hands. One frail, one strong, but both trembling with the weight of love lost and rediscovered. The shelter, once filled with quiet chatter, now felt like a sacred place where something miraculous was happening. Richard turned his head again, eyes finding Angela once more. Thank you, he said, his voice full of sincerity. You've done more for my father than I ever did. Angela shook her head quickly. I only did what anyone should do. He's a good man. Richard's gaze lingered on her, filled with both gratitude and curiosity. He realized in that moment that his father's survival, his chance at this reunion, was because of this woman's simple, selfless kindness. And though Richard was used to controlling empires, striking deals, and calculating numbers, here was something he couldn't measure in money. Angela's compassion was priceless. As father and son embraced for the first time in years, the rain outside the shelter slowed, as if the heavens themselves paused on the moment. Richard, overwhelmed by gratitude, insisted on taking both his father and Angela to his home. He wanted to give his father comfort, and also thank the woman who had shown more kindness than he himself had. But for Angela, stepping into the world of billionaires was like stepping onto another planet. She fell out of place, unsure she belonged in such luxury. The morning outside the shelter was fresh, the rain-washed streets gleaming like mirrors. Birds sang, and the sun pierced through gray clouds, almost as though the world itself wanted to signal a new beginning. Inside, emotion still lingered heavy. Mr. Thomas was wrapped in a warm blanket, his eyes still shining with the remnants of last night's reunion. Beside him, Richard sat quietly, his hand on his father's shoulder, as though afraid that if he let go, he might lose him again. Angela, however, lingered a few steps back. She was relieved for Mr. Thomas, but her heart felt uneasy. The man before her wasn't just any son. He was Richard Thomas, the billionaire. She had seen the luxury cars outside, the assistants waiting, the way people whispered his name in awe. That wasn't her world. Richard rose to his feet and spoke with quiet determination. Dad, I can't let you stay here anymore. You deserve comfort, care, and my presence. From now on, you're coming with me. Mr. Thomas opened his mouth as though to protest, but Richard shook his head gently. Please, Dad, let me make up for all these years. Then Richard's gaze shifted to Angela. He walked toward her, his eyes sincere. And you, he said softly, you can't just walk away. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't even know my father was here. I owe you more than I can ever repay. Angela shook her head quickly, feeling her cheeks warm. No, you don't owe me anything. I didn't do it for anything in return. I only wanted to help. But Richard smiled faintly. And that's exactly why I owe you everything. Before she could respond, he turned to one of his assistants. Prepare the car. We're taking them home. Angela froze. Home? His home? Her eyes darted to Mr. Thomas, who gave her a weak but reassuring smile. Go with us, Angela. Please. You're family now. Family. The word hit her chest like a warm wave, yet her heart filled with hesitation. She was just a cleaning woman, someone who lived paycheck to paycheck, someone whose shoes were still damp from last night's rain. What business did she have stepping into the world of private cars, bodyguards, and billionaires? But Richard insisted, and Angela couldn't bring herself to refuse. Not when Mr. Thomas was looking at her with such gentle trust. Moments later, the sleek black Mercedes purred to life. Richard helped his father into the back seat, while another assistant opened the door for Angela. She hesitated, staring at the luxurious leather seats and polished interior. It felt wrong, like stepping onto a stage where she didn't belong. Please, Richard urged softly. Sit. You've earned this more than anyone. Angela slowly slid into the car, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She glanced at Mr. Thomas, who smiled as though this were all perfectly natural. Richard sat opposite them, his eyes moving between his father and Angela, his expression unreadable. The car pulled away from the shelter, gliding smoothly through the city streets. Angela watched familiar corners pass by, then vanish into neighborhoods she had never entered before. The buildings grew taller, cleaner. The shops turned into designer boutiques. The sidewalks lined with cafes where the wealthy lingered. Her heart pounded harder with every passing block. Finally, the car turned down a private lane and stopped before an iron gate that stretched higher than any fence she had ever seen. Guards nodded as the gate opened, and the car rolled into a world she could never have imagined. Richard's estate. It wasn't just a house. It was a mansion, grand, sprawling, with gleaming windows and gardens so perfectly kept they looked unreal. Fountains sprayed crystal water into the air, marble statues lined the driveway, and luxury cars stood parked like ornaments on display. Angela's breath caught. She pressed herself back into the seat, wishing she could vanish. I don't belong here, she thought. The car stopped, and assistants quickly moved to open the doors. Richard helped his father out gently, while Angela stepped out slowly, her eyes wide, her body stiff with discomfort. Welcome home, Richard said softly, glancing at both of them. Angela wanted to say, this isn't my home, but the words caught in her throat. Inside, the mansion was even more breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceilings. Floors gleamed like mirrors. The walls were lined with paintings worth more than her entire life savings. Every detail screamed wealth. Angela felt smaller with each step. Her shoes squeaked against the marble, her plain dress stark against the elegance surrounding her. She tugged at her sleeves nervously, her mind whispering that she was an intruder here. Richard noticed her unease. Angela, he said gently, don't feel out of place. If anyone deserves to be here, it's you. But Angela couldn't shake the feeling. She thought of her small rented room, of the worn-out stove where she cooked, of the nights she counted coins to make rent. This place wasn't her world. It was his. Meanwhile, Mr. Thomas looked around with quiet wonder. Though he had no desire for riches, seeing his son's home filled him with a strange pride. But his heart remained humble. He turned to Angela and whispered, Don't look at the walls, child. Look at the people. That's what makes a home. Angela forced a small smile, comforted by his words. Richard led them into a sunlit room, where staff quickly brought food, drinks, and warm blankets. He settled his father into a comfortable chair and sat beside him. Angela lingered in the background, unsure whether to sit or stand. Then Richard addressed her directly. Angela, I want you to know something. All the money, all the success I have, it means nothing compared to what you gave my father. You gave him kindness when I didn't. You gave him family when I forgot how. For that, I'll always be grateful. Angela shook her head again, overwhelmed. I didn't do anything special. I just couldn't let him be alone. Richard's voice softened. "And that's what makes you extraordinary." For a moment, their eyes met, and Angela felt something shift, like he wasn't looking at her as a stranger anymore, but as someone who mattered. Still, her heart battled with doubt. The mansion was too grand, the air too polished. She was a woman of simplicity, of little means. This world could never truly be hers. But one thing anchored her: Mr. Thomas's warm smile, his hand reaching out to hold hers as he whispered, "You belong with us, Angela. Don't ever think otherwise." And though Angela didn't yet believe those words, they were the first seeds of a new chapter, one that would challenge her fears, bridge worlds, and test whether kindness truly had the power to unite people from the most different walks of life. As days passed, Angela's bond with Mr. Thomas grew even stronger, and Richard saw something he had long forgotten: the true meaning of family. In Angela's kindness, he rediscovered humility. In his father's forgiveness, he found peace. And in that grand mansion, built by money but empty of warmth, Angela's simple heart brought a light that no fortune could ever buy. The mansion, though glittering with chandeliers and polished marble, had always felt hollow to Richard. Yes, the walls were adorned with priceless art. Yes, the garden stretched as far as the eye could see. Yes, luxury dripped from every corner. But what use was a palace when no laughter filled its rooms? For years, Richard had lived surrounded by wealth, but starved of love. And now, as his father's voice echoed in the halls and Angela's gentle footsteps moved from room to room, the mansion began to feel alive. Each morning, Angela sat with Mr. Thomas in the sunlit garden. They would sip tea while he told her old stories about his younger days, about raising Richard, about the joy of planting flowers and watching them bloom. Angela listened with patience and warmth, her laughter ringing like soft bells whenever he cracked a joke. Sometimes Richard would pause in his busy schedule just to watch them from a distance. He would see his father's tired face brighten as Angela leaned closer, see her hands gently wrap around us to steady him. And every time, guilt pricked his heart. That should have been me, Richard thought. All those years, it should have been me by his side. But rather than drown in regret, he made a decision. He would make up for lost time, no matter what it took. One evening, the three of them sat together at the long dining table. The room was vast, the table able to seat dozens, yet only 3 chairs were occupied. Angela felt awkward at first, and used the silver cutlery and sparkling glasses, but Mr. Thomas's cheerful chatter put her at ease. Richard raised his glass of water. "To new beginnings," he said, looking at both of them. Angela hesitated, but Mr. Thomas smiled and lifted his glass too. "To family," he added softly. The clink of glasses marked a turning point. Days turned into weeks. Slowly, the routines of life changed. Richard, once consumed by endless meetings, began carving out time to sit with his father. He rediscovered the joy of listening to his dad's stories, even if he'd heard them before. He even laughed again, the kind of genuine laughter he hadn't felt since childhood. Angela, though still shy in such a grand world, became an irreplaceable presence. She cooked simple meals for Mr. Thomas when the chefs overcomplicated things. She took him for gentle walks in the garden. She reminded both men that joy didn't come from riches, but from shared moments. For Richard, every glance at Angela stirred something deeper. She was different from anyone he had met in his polished corporate world. She didn't want his money, didn't care about his empire. Her value was her heart, her selflessness, the very thing he realized had been missing in his own life. One night, after settling his father into bed, Richard found Angela in the kitchen, washing dishes with her sleeves rolled up. "You don't have to do that," he said gently. "We have staff for it." Angela glanced over her shoulder, smiling softly. "I know, but sometimes doing little things makes a place feel more like home." Her words struck him. This mansion had never felt like home until she and his father had filled it with warmth. "Angela," Richard said, his voice quieter now, "I don't know how to thank you. You gave my father what I couldn't. You gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever." She shook her head, drying her hands on a cloth. "You don't need to thank me. I only did what my heart told me to do." But Richard stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. And that's exactly what makes you extraordinary. Angela lowered her gaze, her heart fluttering, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't used to such words, especially not from a man like him. The days rolled on, and with them, something beautiful blossomed: trust, love, forgiveness. Mr. Thomas, watching quietly, felt a deep peace. He had feared he would leave this world forgotten and alone. But now he had his son by his side again. And he had Angela, the woman who had shown him love when the world had turned away. One afternoon, he sat them both down in the garden. The sunflowers Angela had planted weeks ago were beginning to bloom, tall and golden, swaying gently in the breeze. "Look at those flowers," Mr. Thomas said, his voice soft but firm. "They remind me of life. You plant seeds, sometimes small, sometimes fragile, but with care, they grow into something beautiful. That's what you two have done. You planted seeds of kindness, forgiveness, and love, and now you're blooming." Angela's eyes filled with tears. Richard swallowed hard, unable to speak. The silence that followed was full of meaning, unspoken, yet deeply understood. From that day forward, Richard no longer saw Angela as just a woman who helped his father. He saw her as family. He saw her as a light that walked into his life when he was blinded by wealth. And Angela, though still humble and unsure, began to feel something shift inside her. She realized that maybe love wasn't about belonging to the same world or having the same riches. Maybe love was about hearts recognizing each other, no matter how far apart they seemed. Months later, the mansion was no longer hollow. Its halls echoed with laughter. Its garden bloomed brighter than ever. And at the heart of it all were three people who had found each other in the most unexpected way: a lonely old man, a billionaire's son, and a kind-hearted woman who had simply chosen not to walk away. In the end, it wasn't money that saved them. It wasn't fame. It was kindness. Kindness that bridged distance. Kindness that healed wounds. Kindness that turned strangers into family. And as Angela stood in the garden one morning, watching Mr. Thomas and Richard laughing together under the golden sunflowers, she whispered a truth that would stay with her forever. You don't need riches to be rich. You only need love.